Welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving into a massive, honestly mind-bending question today. What actually happens when you take neuroscience, consciousness research, ancient mythology, genetics, and socioeconomic evolution, and you examine them all together through a single framework? Now, if you're a technologist, an entrepreneur, or just someone building on the digital frontier, getting a grip on this macro perspective is absolutely crucial to figuring out where we're headed. We're going to take a journey here, starting from rigorous, measurable science and moving right to the edge of speculative theory, just to see how these seemingly disconnected puzzle pieces might actually fit together. To kick things off, we really have to ask ourselves, are we basically treating our brain's most profound states as, just simple stress relief? What if altered states of consciousness aren't just for chilling out, but are actually profound tools for accessing much deeper, highly functional layers of the human operating system? And if we project that curiosity way back to our origins, what if ancient mythological stories aren't just primitive fantasy? What if they actually served as symbolic records, encrypting real historical or maybe even genetic data about human potential? Which brings us right back to the present day. What if humanity is literally entering a major civilizational transition right now, driven all at once by AI, decentralized technology, and this huge renewed interest in consciousness? Today, we're unpacking all of this. We're going to trace that fine line, exactly where hard evidence ends and interpretation begins, while critically examining our whole trajectory as a species. Okay, let's start with the hard science of the brain. Section 1, Unlocking the Theta State, Brainwaves and Practice. So there's a really crucial distinction we need to make right out of the gate. When everyday consumer tech talks about theta, it's usually just measuring scalp EEG, which is electrical activity between 4 and 7 hertz. And sure, that happens naturally when we're drowsy, meditating, or drifting into light sleep. But that surface-level activity is definitely not the same thing as the deeper, incredibly complex hippocampal theta rhythms that fire deep inside the brain's memory centers. Basically, just having more theta on a surface scan isn't automatically a good thing. If you're not careful, high theta just means your alertness is totally collapsing and you're slipping into a microsleep. The actual goal here is a highly stable, internally attentive state, not just dozing off on the couch. Well, how do we reliably access that productive theta window? The evidence really points to foundational tools. Traditional meditation and slow, non-forceful breathing, we're talking about 5 to 6 breaths per minute, have solid, moderate scientific backing. But notice that binaural beats only have mixed evidence in the literature. They can absolutely be a helpful auditory support tool to help you relax, but they aren't some magic brain hack. Finally, there's sleep-adjacent training. Riding that N1 hypnagogic edge right before you fall asleep has a really strong physiological rationale for generating vivid imagery and sudden creative insights. Now, for anyone wanting to actively train this, the research does lay out a protocol. The core principle here is reducing your physical effort while maintaining crystal clear mental awareness. You quiet the body, but you keep the attention sharp. You don't chase the images or try to force any meaning onto them. You just observe. And crucially, you capture whatever memory fragments or insights pop up immediately afterward, without rushing to interpret them in the moment. As you'll see, this kind of cognitive potential definitely hasn't gone unnoticed by the folks in charge. Section 2, Gateway to Altered States, Institutions and MK Ultra. Historically speaking, we're looking at a pretty dark starting point here. The military and intelligence communities have been fascinated by the brain's limits for a long time. The CIA's MK Ultra program, which kicked off in 1953, involved horrific, non-consensual experiments on human subjects before most of the records were destroyed in 1973. It's a really stark reminder that altered state research absolutely must always be rooted in strict ethics and consent. Fast forward a decade to 1983, and we see the U.S. Army formally assessing the Monroe Institute's Gateway process, which was a set of audio techniques designed to induce profound, altered states of consciousness, including out-of-body experiences. Now, we really need to practice some strict epistemic hygiene here. It is a completely confirmed historical fact that the 1983 Army Gateway memo is real. It genuinely maps out a progression through altered states. They call them Focus 10, 12, and 15. But we cannot conflate a military assessment memo with peer-reviewed scientific validation of cosmic consciousness. Just because a military analyst explored astral projection doesn't mean the government scientifically proved those supernatural phenomena actually exist. It's an exploratory assessment document, not a physics paper. And we see a very similar pattern right now with unidentified anomalous phenomena, or UAPs. The highest credibility modern investigations like NASA's independent study and the DoD's ARROW reports consistently state that yes, anomalous events genuinely do occur, but we simply lack sufficient data to explain them. The reviewed evidence does not establish extraterrestrial origins or recovered off-world technology. We have to separate the verifiable fact of institutional investigation from the wildly speculative conclusions that people often jump to. To really get to the bottom of these mysteries, we have to look inward, down to our code. Section 3, Mystery of Non-Coding DNA, the junk DNA myth. Remember back in the 1990s when scientists confidently claimed that 98% of our DNA did absolutely nothing? They literally dubbed it junk DNA. Well, the massive ENCODE project completely dismantled that rather arrogant myth. We now know that roughly 80% of the human genome is biochemically active. It is definitely not junk. It's the hidden control panel. So what is all this so-called junk actually doing? Turns out it's a wildly complex operating system. We've got non-coding RNA genes that regulate other genes. We have enhancers and silencers that act like little light switches, turning protein production on and off in specific tissues. And incredibly, about 45% of our genome consists of transposable elements. These are ancient viral sequences that integrated into our DNA over millions of years of evolution. It is just an astonishingly intricate regulatory network. Because this genetic machinery is so incredibly mysterious, it naturally acts as a launchpad for alternative theories. Mainstream science stops at epigenetics and regulatory networks. But in speculative circles, you'll find hypotheses claiming that humanity's original DNA was deliberately suppressed by ancient genetic engineers, specifically a group called the Anunnaki, and that this dormant DNA can actually be reactivated using frequency, theta consciousness, or spiritual practices. Now, to be clear, we are stepping firmly into the realm of speculative, unproven interpretation here, but you have to admit it forms a pretty fascinating bridge between modern biology and ancient mythology. So let's actually journey back in time to examine those source texts. Section 4, Ancient Myths and Origins. The Anunnaki mythos. The roots of all this lie in Sumeria, in ancient Mesopotamia. They gave us the world's oldest written records, etched right into cuneiform clay tablets. These historic texts include the Enuma Elish, a creation epic where gods create humans from clay and divine essence. The Atra Hasis epic, which describes lesser gods laboring until humans are basically created to take over the heavy lifting. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, which features a massive flood narrative that long predates the biblical story of Genesis. But to separate actual history from modern myth, we have to ask, who were the Anunnaki? Well, in the actual, correctly translated Mesopotamian texts, the Anunnaki were simply a pantheon of gods, or those of royal blood. But in the 1970s, an author named Zechariah Sitchin offered a vastly different take. He claimed the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from a planet called Nibiru, who genetically engineered humans as a slave race 450,000 years ago just to mine gold. And while Sitchin's ideas are massively popular in alternative history and ancient astronaut theories, mainstream Assyriologists completely reject his very idiosyncratic translations. But regardless of whether you read these ancient texts as literal history or pure mythology, they introduce some incredibly powerful archetypes. We see this stark, defining contrast between two primary Sumerian figures, Enlil and Enki. Enlil represents law, dominance, restriction, and was actually the architect of the Great Flood. Basically, he represents control. On the flip side, Enki is associated with wisdom, water, and DNA, and is often depicted as saving humanity and offering forbidden knowledge. He represents liberation. Alternative researchers map these exact same archetypes onto later Gnostic and biblical traditions, often seeing Enki as the symbolic serpent offering knowledge in the garden. So how does this ancient, mythical battle for liberation map onto our current reality? Section 5, Arc of Human Civilization, Socioeconomic Evolution. If we trace the macroscopic socioeconomic evolution of our species, a very distinct pattern emerges. We started out in a tribal phase, with egalitarian resource sharing and personal sovereignty. Then, as we moved into agrarian empires like Sumeria, we saw the invention of debt and centralized temple economies. Next came feudalism, where wealth was entirely locked up in land. That eventually evolved into industrial capitalism, which commodified human labor on a global scale. And finally, here we are in the digital age, where power is intensely centralized in abstract data, surveillance, and algorithms. Basically, there's a long historical arc moving away from individual sovereignty and toward increasingly centralized systems of control. Which brings us right to the precipice of Phase 6. We are standing on totally contested terrain right now. On one hand, we could easily slide into techno-feudalism, where massive platform companies act as our new feudal lords, controlling our data, our algorithms, and our livelihoods. On the other hand, there are some incredibly liberating concepts emerging, things like an AI-driven post-scarcity economy, or the sovereign individual model, where cryptography and decentralized finance actually allow people to opt out of centralized control and return to community-driven regenerative economies. And honestly, this is where our entire framework converges. If humanity possesses dormant biological or cognitive capacities, maybe accessed through theta consciousness, or locked within our regulatory DNA, and if our history has been this progressive loss of sovereignty to centralized systems, then this current collision of AI, crypto, and consciousness research represents a genuine phase reset. It's a real window of opportunity for builders, technologists, and researchers to reclaim economic sovereignty and rebuild our systems with actual human liberation in mind. We've covered an immense amount of ground today, from the measurable science of brainwaves to ancient mythology, all the way to the far reaches of futuristic economics. But ultimately, the most important question may not be whether every single speculative theory explored in this report is literally true. The deeper question is whether humanity can develop the wisdom to actually navigate this massive phase reset and rebuild with our original architecture in mind. Can we integrate our growing technological power with a deeper understanding of our own consciousness to build a future that finally prioritizes human potential? I'll leave you to think about that. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.